They say information is power. But in today's world, power decides what information becomes truth. Across continents and languages, billions wake up each day to the same headlines, rewritten, reworded, but identical in rhythm, tone, and framing. Stories that seem spontaneous. Outrage that feels organic. But behind the noise lies a structure, invisible, intentional, and old. A web of ownership so dense that the average citizen cannot see it, even when the strings are right in front of them. This is the story of how 8 out of every 10 news stories you consume come from the same handful of hands. And how, without realizing it, the world surrendered its freedom of thought to a cartel of influence hiding in plain sight. In the beginning, news was simple. It was local, fragmented, human. Journalists chased leads, editors fought for truth, and newspapers competed for credibility. But as money found its way into every corner of modern life, the news, like everything else, became a business. Then that business became an empire. By the early 2000s, something shifted. Hedge funds and global asset managers began quietly buying media companies, not because they care about journalism, but because they understood something deeper. Control the narrative, and you control perception. Control perception, and you control behavior. Today, a handful of financial giants, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and a network of sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf, Asia, and Europe, hold a majority of shares in almost every major Western media outlet. Fox, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, even the platforms that distribute their content, Google, Meta, X, are entangled in the same investor web. It's not a conspiracy. It's structure. In the United States, 3 investment firms collectively manage more than $20 trillion. Through complex chains of mutual funds and cross-ownership, they hold voting power in companies that produce the news, advertise in it, and regulate it. It means when a story threatens the financial interests of those investors, it quietly disappears. When a policy aligns with their portfolio, it suddenly becomes urgent, important, or inevitable. But this web doesn't stop in the West. In the Middle East, sovereign wealth funds from Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia have poured billions into Western media, film, and tech platforms. Al Jazeera projects power across the Arab world while investing in English-speaking networks that shape global perception of their rivals. In China, state-linked conglomerates have acquired stakes in Hollywood studios, social platforms, and overseas publishers. In Russia, media has long been a weapon, but Western corporations have learned that game too. The difference is subtle but lethal. When authoritarian states control information, we call it propaganda. When corporations do it through shareholding, we call it business. Think about that. A journalist today might believe they're independent. They can choose their words, their angles, their interviews. But behind their newsroom sits an editor, and above that editor sits a board. That board answers to shareholders. Shareholders who rarely understand or care about journalism, but who always understand the bottom line. When truth collides with profit, profit wins. Consider this. 5 corporations control roughly 90% of all U.S. media. Comcast, Disney, News Corp, Paramount, and Warner Brothers Discovery. They own everything from news outlets to movie studios to sports networks. Their subsidiaries compete for your attention. But behind closed doors, their boards often overlap. Executives move from one company to another. Advertisers cross-promote. Politicians attend their events. It's a revolving door between information and influence. Now extend this model globally. The BBC, once a symbol of public independence, faces funding pressures that push it toward private partnerships. Reuters and Associated Press, the world's 2 largest news wire services, feed thousands of outlets daily, yet they too rely on corporate and government contracts. If a wire service decides to frame a conflict a certain way, the entire world inherits that framing. Word for word, image for image. That is how narrative becomes reality. The hidden web doesn't censor everything outright. It doesn't need to. It simply decides what deserves oxygen, what's amplified, what's ignored, and most importantly, what's repeated until it becomes accepted as truth. That's the genius of modern propaganda. It doesn't feel forced. It feels familiar. Consider the wars we've watched on television: Iraq, Libya, Syria, Ukraine. Each began with a moral script: freedom, democracy, intervention. Each one simplified the good versus evil. But beneath those words, vast financial interests were at stake. Oil contracts, reconstruction deals, energy routes, arms markets. And the same institutions that own the media often had stakes in those industries too. When you connect those dots, neutrality collapses. Even tech platforms, once hailed as the liberators of free speech, are now pillars of the same architecture. Google's YouTube algorithm determines which documentaries are recommended and which vanish into the void. Meta decides which protests are safe to share. Twitter, or X, adjusts visibility based on undefined trust metrics. Behind every moderation policy is a boardroom, and behind every boardroom is capital. Every click feeds a machine. Every search reinforces the illusion of choice. But the web doesn't just control what you see. It shapes how you feel. It manufactures fatigue. It drowns you in crises until outrage becomes apathy. You start to think corruption is normal, power is distant, and truth is unknowable. That is psychological warfare through information overload. And while audiences fight each other over ideology, the architect of the web grows richer, unbothered, unseen, and untouchable. Now imagine how this structure affects democracy. Voters no longer decide based on raw information, but on curated emotion. Elections become performances. Candidates spend more on advertising than on policy. Social movements rise and fall, depending on their alignment with investor sentiment. This is not an accident. It's design. When you look at who funds think tanks, fact-checking organizations, and NGOs that monitor misinformation, you find the same names, the same donors, the same investment funds, the same governments. The web doesn't just own the narrative. It also polices what challenges it. And the irony? Most people defending free press are unknowingly defending the very system that neutralized it. The illusion of diversity keeps the machine alive. Left-wing outlets, right-wing outlets, radical, moderate, conservative, progressive, all exist to give you a sense of choice. But their advertisers, their investors, their parent companies? Identical. Competing ideologies, united economics. So what happens to real journalism? The kind that questions power rather than recycles it? It's starved. Independent reporters are deplatformed, defunded, or buried under algorithmic noise. Investigations into financial elites are labeled conspiracies, not because they're false, but because they're dangerous. Yet the truth has a strange way of surviving. In every generation, a few voices cut through the fog, not because they have power, but because they have nothing left to lose. They expose the documents, trace the shell companies, follow the money. They remind us that information is not just data, it's a weapon, and whoever holds it decides the future. This is why the web fears transparency more than revolution. Revolutions can be crushed. Transparency spreads silently. Once you see the strings, the puppet show loses its magic. The question is not whether the news is controlled. It's how deeply we've accepted it. How willingly we let algorithms and corporations tell us what matters. How comfortable we become living inside a narrative designed for us, not by us. But power has a flaw. It believes in permanence. It forgets that truth doesn't need permission. The same tools built to manipulate, the internet, social platforms, data leaks, are now exposing the system that created them. Audiences are waking up one documentary, one headline, one quiet doubt at a time. And as more people ask, who really owns the story, the web begins to tremble. Because control only works as long as you don't notice it. So the next time you read the news, ask yourself, who benefits if I believe this? Who profits from my outrage? Who funds a platform showing me this story? You might find that the answer, no matter the country, the channel, or the ideology, leads back to the same few hands, hidden behind the curtain, guiding the world perception for their gain. That's the real power of the hidden web. It doesn't just own the news. It owns what you think truth feels like,